History Secrets.
The simplest answer may be the most uncomfortable of all. Who you are may not matter as much as you believe. When someone asks, "Who are you?" a story is expected. Name, origin, experiences, dreams, identity. But what if, in practice, all of that is irrelevant? From the perspective of larger structures, you are not a story. You are a functional category, a label, a young person, a potential worker, an available resource. This reduction is not a mistake. It is a mechanism. States do not operate with individuals. They operate with classifications, because classifying is the first step to controlling, and controlling is the first step to extracting value. When you stop being a person and become a function, you become predictable, usable, replaceable. And this raises an uncomfortable question. If the system needs you to produce more, how does it ensure you keep moving? The answer is simple. Anxiety. Not just any anxiety. A structured anxiety. A continuous, calculated, and invisible anxiety. And one of the most effective ways to generate this anxiety is through a seemingly neutral concept. Debt. When you enter into debt, something changes. Time stops being yours. The future starts to belong to another entity. You no longer work just to live. You work to pay. And the problem is not just the debt itself. It is the fact that it rarely ends. Interest prolongs the cycle. Payment never fully concludes. And within this infinite cycle, something happens. You produce more, much more, far beyond what you would produce if you were free. Now think about this in another way. If people were not under pressure, would they work the same way? If there were no fear of scarcity, would the effort be the same? Probably not. And this is where an even more provocative idea emerges. The value of money may not be in the money, but in the belief that it is scarce. Because if money were abundant, it would lose its main function, to motivate behavior, for you to desire something. It is necessary that someone else does not have it. Poverty, in this context, stops being just a social problem. It becomes a structural element, a necessary contrast. Without it, desire weakens. Ambition decreases. The system slows down. And this explains something curious. Why, even in a world with productive abundance, does scarcity still exist? Why is there still hunger, even with enough production to feed everyone? Perhaps because scarcity, in many cases, is not an accident, but a construction. Economic crises follow a similar logic. They are taught as failures, unpredictable events. But what if they have a function? When too much money is circulating, work loses urgency, people relax. They invest less effort to restore the dynamic. Something needs to be done. The excess needs to disappear. And that is exactly what crises do. They destroy wealth. They reduce the sense of abundance and give money back its appearance of scarcity. And with that, they restore the cycle. Work, effort, competition. The same reasoning can be applied to something even more extreme. War, traditionally explained as a dispute over resources. War carries another layer. It destroys wealth on a large scale. Infrastructure, capital, lives, stability. And by destroying, it recreates the feeling of lack. And by recreating lack, it reinforces the value of what remains. But perhaps the most revealing analogy comes from an unexpected place. Games. In a game, you work to accumulate resources. Coins, points, credits. Now imagine if these resources were infinite. If you could obtain everything, instantly. The game would lose meaning. The challenge would disappear. Engagement would drop. The system would collapse. And then, the inevitable question arises. What if the real world operates under a similar logic? What if the sense of scarcity is what keeps everyone in motion? What if value is not in the resource, but in the difficulty of obtaining it? If that is the case, then the system does not depend only on production. It depends on perception, on belief, on a shared narrative. A narrative where working is necessary, where competing is inevitable, and where stopping is not an option. If all of this sounds uncomfortable, it is because it challenges something deeper. Not just the system, but the way you interpret the world. Because changing this perception is not simple. It is rooted from an early age. You learn to fear lack. You learn that failure leads to misery. You learn that effort is the only way out, but you rarely learn to question the structure behind it. And when someone tries to explain this structure, the natural reaction is resistance. Because accepting this idea means admitting that much of what was taught may be incomplete. Now observe another phenomenon. Throughout history, individuals have emerged who concentrated power at extraordinary levels. They monopolized entire sectors. They controlled essential infrastructures. And what is most intriguing is not the result. It is the process. How does a single person manage to dominate an entire industry? Railroads, steel, oil, bandolier, financial systems. These are not small sectors. They are pillars of a nation, and yet they were centralized. The common explanation is simple: hard work, vision, intelligence, opportunity. But this explanation alone does not account for the scale of the phenomenon, because growing is one thing, completely dominating is another. And this raises an uncomfortable hypothesis. What if these individuals were not acting alone? What if there were an invisible structure, financing, directing, and sustaining this growth? A network that does not appear in books, but operates behind the scenes. If this is considered, some questions begin to make more sense. Where did the initial capital at massive scale come from? How were competitors absorbed so quickly? Why were certain monopolies allowed? And more importantly, why were these structures never fully dismantled? The traditional narrative speaks of individual merit, but ignores the role of external capital. And perhaps that is not a coincidence, because the idea of the self-made individual is extremely useful. It creates hope, motivates effort, feeds the system, but it also hides the real complexity. If we move forward in time, the pattern seems to repeat. New companies, new billionaires, new stories of meteoric success, young people who drop out of universities, and within a few years build global empires. The explanation remains the same: talent, vision, innovation. But again, the scale raises doubts. Fundamental technologies do not emerge from nothing. They have origins, and many of these origins are linked to military projects, digital infrastructures, networks, information systems, tools initially created for strategic purposes and later made available to the public. But this transition is not random. It follows a logic. If a technology can expand control, it needs to be adopted at scale. But there's a problem. If it comes directly from a power institution, it generates distrust. People resist. But if it comes through accessible figures, entrepreneurs, innovators, the perception changes completely. The same technology, with a different narrative, becomes acceptable and even desirable. And then an even more complex idea emerges: the possibility that there are structures operating beyond the visible surface. Structures that do not present themselves as formal power, but influence decisions on a large scale, and that, often, do not perceive themselves as controllers, but as executors of something greater. This explains a curious behavior: the feeling that decisions are made, not only by rational interest, but by a kind of absolute conviction, as if there were a mission, a higher order, a justification that goes beyond common logic. And this leads to a delicate point. When someone believes they are fulfilling a greater purpose, they can do anything, even the unthinkable, not out of direct malice, but out of conviction. Now consider a simple analogy. Imagine an empire built over decades. accumulated wealth, consolidated structure, established control, and then this empire is passed to someone new, without experience, without discipline, but with total freedom. What happens? The tendency is not to preserve. It is to alter, replace specialists with close allies, make impulsive decisions, take unnecessary risks. Because from an individual perspective, the objective changes from maintaining the system to exploiting the system, and this reveals something fundamental. Not all power is exercised with strategic vision. Often, it is driven by impulse, and this impulse follows a simple principle: maximize gains with the least possible effort. This is a basic human pattern. Greed and laziness are not exceptions, they are tendencies. And when these tendencies operate at scale, they shape entire systems. Sometimes the key is not in understanding the system, but in understanding who is operating within it. And when you shift that lens, certain figures begin to look different. Leaders stop appearing as rational strategists and begin to behave like something more unstable, less predictable, more impulsive, perhaps closer to a faction leader than to an institutional administrator. This does not mean a lack of intelligence, but it reveals another priority: self-interest. The logic stops being collective and becomes personal. What benefits me now? What improves my image? What strengthens my immediate position? And when decisions are made based on that, the consequences can be wide-reaching, even when they seem irrational at first glance. They make sense within this individual logic. Consider actions that, externally, seem excessive: direct interventions, risky operations, displays of force. They can generate immediate impact. They can impress. But they also create side effects: distrust, broken alliances, loss of credibility. And here, a paradox emerges. Something can be strategically harmful and still be executed, because the objective is not necessarily the best global outcomes, but the best personal outcome in the short term. When this happens repeatedly, something larger begins to take shape: an acceleration, not necessarily of growth, but of erosion. Structures that were once stable begin to show cracks. Decisions that would once be avoided begin to be normalized, and what was once an exception becomes the pattern. This kind of movement is not immediate. It is gradual, but once it begins, it gains speed, and it can lead to a breaking point. Now expand this view, not just to individuals, but to entire systems. Throughout history, great powers have followed a similar pattern: rise, expansion, consolidation, and then maintenance. But maintaining power is more difficult than acquiring it, because it requires balance, control, discipline, and often that balance depends on something counterintuitive: creating instability outside itself. By shifting conflicts to other regions, a system preserves its own internal structure. This is not new. It is a recurring strategy. If a dominant power fears losing relevance, it may encourage external divisions, because a fragmented environment is easier to control. This logic helps explain certain historical patterns: successive conflicts, indirect interventions, unstable alliances, not as isolated events, but as part of a continuous strategy to prevent any other power from reaching a higher level of balance. Because balance generates autonomy, and autonomy reduces dependence. And dependence is one of the pillars of control. Moving into the present, this dynamic takes on new forms. It is no longer just about territory, but about production chains, strategic resources, global infrastructure, energy, technology, logistics. Power is not only in owning, but in controlling flows. And when flows are interrupted, the impact is immediate. Trade slows down. Economies suffer. Dependencies are exposed. And in this scenario, new tensions arise, not only military, but economic, silent, continuous, and often invisible to those outside the process. Now imagine being inside this system, being a nation that depends on external relationships, that needs to balance interests. On one side, a traditional power. On the other, an emerging partner. Both offering benefits, both imposing risks. How to choose? This choice is rarely simple, because it does not involve only economics. It involves history, memory, past interventions, trust built or destroyed over time. And in this context, decisions are not made only based on data, but on accumulated experiences. And it is exactly here that complexity reaches another level, because what appears to be a dispute between countries may, in fact, be a dispute between systems, different models of organization, of control, of expansion, and each model carries its own logic, its own narrative, its own justification. And within these narratives, each side believes it is right, not necessarily because of evidence, but because of conviction. And when conviction replaces analysis, the conflict stops being only strategic. It becomes ideological. When an ideology distances itself from reality, something fundamental breaks: the capacity for correction. Without this capacity, the system loses one of its most important mechanisms: adjustment. And without adjustment, errors stop being corrected. They begin to be amplified. This was one of the central observations of one of the most compelling analyses of the 20th century. The idea that extreme regimes do not fail due to lack of intention, but due to excess of conviction. Conviction that replaces evidence. Conviction that ignores limits. Conviction that redefines what is real. These systems share three essential characteristics. The first is the detachment from reality. They do not operate based on facts. They operate based on beliefs. And when facts conflict with these beliefs, they are discarded. Reality stops being a reference and becomes an obstacle. The second characteristic is the obsession with movement. Growth becomes proof of legitimacy. Expansion becomes a sign of truth. If something is advancing, then it is right. It does not matter if that advance leads to destruction. The movement itself becomes justification. And the third characteristic is the active rejection of reality. It is not enough to ignore. It is necessary to confront, challenge limits, force situations, persist even in the face of evident collapse. Because, within this logic, to retreat would be to admit error, and admitting error is incompatible with absolute belief. This pattern does not belong only to the past. It can be observed in different contexts, in different forms, sometimes explicitly, sometimes subtly. But the structure remains: disconnection, expansion, confrontation with reality. And when these three forces align, the result tends to be the same: escalation. Now observe a contemporary phenomenon: the massive investment in new technologies, especially those related to artificial intelligence. The dominant narrative speaks of innovation, efficiency, optimization. But there is another possibility. What if the main objective is not only productivity? What if the most relevant application is not in creation, but in control? Consider a system where everything is tracked. Every purchase, every movement, every interaction. Data is continuously collected, processed in real time, and transformed into behavioral profiles. These profiles do not only describe who you are, they anticipate who you will be, and more than that, they allow influence, suggest, redirect, condition decisions. In this scenario, control is not imposed directly. It is integrated, silent, progressive, almost imperceptible. And this raises a critical question. If a system can predict your behavior, can it also shape it? If it can shape it, to what extent are your choices still yours? This is not a technical question. It is a structural question about autonomy, about freedom, about awareness. At the same time, another movement is happening, a silent shift of power. Highly capitalized individuals and groups detach themselves from territories. They do not belong to countries. They belong to capital. And capital has no borders. It moves to where it is most efficient, to where it is most protected, to where it grows faster. Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong. Strategic locations, favorable environments. But this mobility has a cost. It breaks traditional ties, national identity, social responsibility, collective commitment. All of this becomes secondary. And then a new type of structure emerges, not based on geography, but on connection. Networks that operate beyond borders, that share common interests, and that function based on internal trust. But this trust is not public. It is restricted, built over time, protected by invisible codes. And here we return to an old concept: closed societies, groups that operate discreetly, but highly coordinated. And that offers something essential: reliability in an uncertain environment. Because when capital moves globally, it needs guarantees. It needs to know who it can rely on, where to invest, how to protect its interests. And these structures offer exactly that. Not visibility, but security. Not exposure, but continuity. And this explains why they persist. Not because of mystery, but because of function. If these structures seem distant, it is because they operate far from the visible surface. But their effects are everyday. They appear in simple decisions, choices that seem individual, but that are often shaped by larger forces. Education, for example. In theory, it should be about learning, formation, critical capacity. But in practice, other factors come into play: prestige, perception, social signaling, and often, the perceived value of an institution is not in what it teaches, but in how it is seen. This reveals an important pattern. Form can override content. Appearance can replace substance. And when that happens, the criteria for choice changes. It is no longer about quality. It is about image. And image is something that can be constructed, manipulated, amplified. The same principle can be observed on a larger scale. Conflicts that seem strategic may, in some cases, be sustained for symbolic reasons. Wars that cannot be won, but continue to be fought, not because of military logic, but because of reputational logic. Because retreat can be interpreted as weakness, and in certain systems, appearing weak is more dangerous than losing. This creates a difficult cycle to break. Even when defeat is evident, the effort continues. Resources are invested. Lives are committed. Time is consumed. All to sustain a narrative. The narrative of strength, of control, of superiority. And this raises an inevitable question. How many decisions are actually made based on outcome? And how many are made based on perception? When perception becomes the priority, reality loses space. And when reality loses space, risk increases, because systems that ignore limits eventually encounter them. Now bring all these elements together. Structures that classify individuals, mechanisms that create scarcity, systems that depend on perception, technologies that expand control, capital that moves without borders. None of this works in isolation. It works together, as an integrated system. A system that does not need absolute control, only sufficient direction, enough to maintain movement, enough to maintain engagement, enough to maintain production. And then the central question emerges. If the system depends on your participation, to what extent do you really choose to participate? If your motivations are influenced, if your fears are structured, if your opportunities are directed, where does your autonomy begin? Perhaps the answer is not in rejecting the system, but in understanding it, because understanding does not eliminate the structure, but it changes your position within it. You stop reacting automatically and begin to observe. You stop just following and begin to question. And in some moments, that alone is enough to change everything. If all of this seems complex, it is because we are dealing with layers that are not usually visible, layers that do not appear in everyday life, but that shape everyday life. And perhaps the most important point is not to prove whether every detail is true or not, but to understand the logic behind these ideas. Because, regardless of the form, there are patterns that repeat. Control through classification, motivation through scarcity, direction through perception. These three elements, combined, are enough to structure an entire system. And within this system, people do not need to be directly forced. They move on their own. They seek security. They avoid risk. They pursue stability. And by doing that, they end up reinforcing exactly the structure that limits them. This is the paradox. The system does not need to prevent you from leaving. It only needs to make sure you do not want to leave. But something else that still needs to be considered. If there is influence, that does not mean a total absence of choice. It only means that choice does not occur in a neutral space. It occurs within a context, with pressures, with incentives, with limitations. And recognizing this is not weakness. It is clarity. Because, in the end, what defines your position is not only the system, but the way you interact with it. If you accept everything without questioning, you become predictable. If you reject everything without understanding, you become reactive. But if you observe, analyze, and understand, you become conscious. And consciousness changes behavior, even if in subtle ways. Perhaps the true breaking point is not in major events, nor in immediate external changes, but in something much simpler, the way you perceive. Because perception defines interpretation. Interpretation defines action, and action defines outcome. And in this cycle, small changes can generate big differences. So the initial question returns. Who are you? Perhaps you are still a name, a story, a trajectory. But perhaps you are also something beyond that. An agent within a complex system, with limitations, but also with possibilities. And understanding this duality may be the first step, not to fully escape, but to avoid being guided without realizing it. Because, in the end, the system continues to exist. The structures remain. The mechanisms keep operating. But the way you position yourself within it, that can still change. Throughout history, civilizations have risen, disappeared, and left clues scattered through time. Some of these clues have been discovered. Others are still waiting to be revealed. And in the next documentary, we will explore one of these mysteries. This is History Secrets. Subscribe and continue exploring history with us. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History Secrets.
To understand the critique of modern consumerism, some analysts begin by revisiting a controversial idea: the relationship between capitalism, socialism, and the transformations of the 20th century. For a long time, It was believed that Karl Marx had incorrectly predicted the course of history. Communism did not first emerge in the most advanced industrial societies. It appeared in Russia, and then in China. Meanwhile, industrialized countries in Europe and the United States followed a different path, or at least that was how it seemed. But there is an alternative interpretation. According to this view, after World War II, many Western societies partially adopted principles that resembled Marxist thinking. The worker came to occupy a central position in the organization of society. Governments invested in public healthcare systems, accessible education, labor protections. Labor unions gained political strength. Organized workers pushed for reforms. And much of the post-war prosperity was directed towards strengthening the middle class. During the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, many Western economies experienced a period of relatively balanced expansion. Stable jobs, affordable universities, and robust public services. In this model, productive labor was considered the main engine of society, producing goods, building infrastructure, developing technology. Money itself was seen merely as a tool, not as the center of the system. But starting in the 1980s, something began to change. Some analysts describe this moment as a revolt of the elites. According to this interpretation, economic elites began to reject overly egalitarian societies. Equality reduces differences in power and reduces the concentration of wealth. In this context, policies associated with neoliberalism emerged. Financial deregulation, reduction of union power, privatizations. In the United States, this period became associated with the reforms of the Reagan era. In the United Kingdom, with the policies of Margaret Thatcher. The result was a profound shift in the economic structure. The central figure of society was no longer the worker, but the consumer. At first glance, this shift seemed small, but its consequences were deep. In the previous model, governments promised stable jobs, long-term careers, social security. In the new model, the promise changed. Now the goal was to offer low prices, a wide variety of products, and freedom of consumption. This change also altered the way people relate to society. The worker tends to think politically. He needs to organize, form unions, negotiate rights, pressure governments. The consumer, on the other hand, thinks differently. He competes, chooses products, seeks individual advantages. To understand this logic, imagine a simple thought experiment. Suppose each person in a community receives $1 million. The first reaction would likely be to buy something. Maybe a house, maybe a car, maybe travel. After these initial purchases, something curious would begin to happen. Social comparisons. One person buys a large house. Another buys an even larger one. Photos appear on social media. Prestige begins to be measured by what each person owns. Who has more? Who has better? Who appears more successful? In this process, the initial money quickly runs out, but the desire for status remains. The solution found by many would be to turn to credit, loans, financing, debt, and gradually, the competition for social prestige pushes everyone toward increasing levels of debt. Each person tries to outdo the other. But there is another consequence of this process: the erosion of solidarity. When everyone competes for individual status, it becomes harder to build collective cooperation. Friendships become comparisons. Social relationships begin to include economic calculations. In this context emerges what some thinkers call total economic logic, a way of seeing the world exclusively through financial value. Personal relationships begin to be evaluated by utility. Careers are chosen solely for financial return. Education becomes an investment. Even intimate decisions can be influenced by calculations of status and income. When this kind of logic dominates a culture, the entire society begins to function like a market. Everything can be compared. Everything can be priced. According to this critique, this system produces something paradoxical, an extremely efficient form of social control. Because unlike traditional slavery, no one feels they are being forced. People choose to participate in the system. They want to participate. They seek recognition through it. And precisely because of that, they rarely rebel against it. This phenomenon has been described by some thinkers as the perfect form of servitude. A situation in which individuals work intensely, compete constantly, and accumulate debt, but believe they are exercising freedom because they are choosing to consume. In this sense, consumerism can function as a powerful structure of social organization, a system that channels individual ambitions into a continuous cycle of production and consumption. According to this interpretation, understanding this mechanism is essential to grasp many dynamics of the contemporary world: inequality, detriment, social pressure, and also the way cultural and economic values shape our daily choices. Because, in the end, economic systems are not just financial structures, they are also systems of values, systems that deeply influence how people think, live, and imagine the future. If we accept this interpretation, consumerism is not just an economic phenomenon. It is also a psychological and social system. A system that shapes how people perceive success, happiness, and identity. In this model, society begins to function as a permanent arena of competition. Each individual seeks visible signs of prestige: bigger house, more expensive car, more sophisticated travel. These signs function as social markers. They indicate position in the economic hierarchy. Over time, this competition transforms everyday behavior. People begin to make decisions based not only on necessity, but also on social comparison. The goal is no longer just to live well. It becomes to appear successful. Social media amplifies this process. Photos of trips, houses, restaurants, lifestyles. Each image becomes a small symbol of status, and each symbol generates new comparisons. This dynamic can produce constant psychological pressure, the feeling that there is always someone living better, earning more, owning more. In response, many individuals try to keep up with this standard, even if it means taking on debt. Credit becomes an essential tool of this system. Financing, cards, loans. They allow people to consume today what they still cannot afford. But this mechanism also creates financial dependence, long-term monthly payments, extended commitments. Gradually, a significant portion of income becomes allocated to paying these obligations, which reduces real economic freedom. At this point, a paradox emerges. Modern societies celebrate individual freedom, but at the same time produce high levels of debt. This debt limits choices, restricts mobility, and creates constant pressure to maintain stable income. Another consequence involves social fragmentation. When everyone competes for individual status, collective cooperation can weaken. Workers stop organizing. Communities become more fragmented. Common interests become less visible. In this environment, power structures can operate with less resistance, because collective attention is focused on individual disputes. This logic helps explain why consumption movements often replace political debates. Choosing products becomes a form of personal expression, while broader structural issues remain in the background. For some analysts, this process creates an extremely stable system, because it combines economic incentives with deep psychological motivations. People work intensely to earn money to consume to demonstrate success. And this demonstration reinforces the collective desire to keep participating in the system. Thus, the cycle perpetuates itself. Production, consumption, comparison, debt nuance. In this sense, consumerism can be interpreted as a sophisticated form of social organization, a system that channels individual ambition to keep the economic machine running. This does not mean it is inevitably negative. Consumption also drives innovation, creates jobs, stimulates entrepreneurial creativity. But understanding its cultural and psychological effects helps reveal dimensions of this system that are often invisible. Especially when we think about questions such as happiness, identity, and purpose. Because, despite material abundance in many modern societies, research shows that levels of anxiety and dissatisfaction remain high. This contrast raises important questions. To what extent does material prosperity guarantee well-being? And to what extent do societies need to balance economic growth with other values? Values such as community, free time, human relationships, collective meaning. Answering these questions may be one of the great cultural challenges of the 21st century. Because understanding how consumerism works does not necessarily mean abandoning IT, but it may help societies rethink priorities, and perhaps find ways to combine economic prosperity with more balanced lives. In the end, social systems always reflect human choices, and choices can change. When new ideas emerge, when new generations question what they inherited. Perhaps the future depends precisely on this capacity for collective reflection, to look at the system we live in, and ask whether it truly represents the kind of society we want to build. This was just one of the many enigmas that have crossed the centuries. Around the world, there are lost cities, indecipherable manuscripts, and historical events that still challenge our understanding. Some of these mysteries have begun to be revealed. Others remain completely unexplained. And in the next documentary, we will explore one of these enigmas that continues to intrigue historians to this day. Because when it comes to the history of humanity, there is always a new secret waiting to be discovered. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History Secrets.
To understand what may happen in the coming years, Some analysts begin by observing a recurring pattern in history: the cycle of rise, decline, and collapse of societies. These three stages appear repeatedly throughout human history. Empires emerge, grow rapidly, stabilize for a period, and eventually enter decline. But it is important to understand that decline does not necessarily mean everything immediately gets worse. Decline often simply means that progress slows down, things stop improving, and begin to stagnate. Collapse, however, is different. Collapse occurs when a society rapidly loses its stability. Institutions stop functioning, conflicts intensify, and social order begins to disintegrate. Each of these phases has specific characteristics. During the phase of rise, societies tend to be open. Openness means something simple: opportunity. Poor people can become wealthy. Talent is valued. Innovation is encouraged. Criticism is seen as useful. In rising societies, public debate is encouraged. New ideas are discussed. Mistakes are corrected quickly. This collective energy drives economic and cultural growth, though. Interestingly, this phenomenon does not necessarily depend on the political system. Different regimes can go through phases of openness when they are in a phase of rise. In the mid-20th century, for example, both the United States and China experienced periods of great social mobilization. Both sought to build strong and innovative societies. But as time passes, changes begin to occur. When societies enter the phase of decline, bureaucratic structures tend to grow. Bureaucracy emerges when institutions try to preserve stability. Officials begin to create increasingly detailed rules. Administrative processes become more complex. Organizations begin to focus more on maintaining the existing system than on innovating. At this stage, the priority is no longer progress. The priority becomes stability, keeping everything functioning exactly as it is. But when decline deepens, something else happens. Society may enter an authoritarian phase. At this stage, power no longer depends on consent and begins to depend on force. To illustrate this difference, imagine 3 ways of making a simple decision: choosing where to have lunch. In the phase of rise, everyone discusses, debates options, and decides together through consensus or voting. In the phase of decline, the process changes. The decision still appears voluntary, but someone manipulates information to influence the outcomes, perhaps by promising advantages that do not exist. In the phase of collapse, there is no longer negotiation. Someone simply imposes the decision, and those who disobey face punishment. This model can be summarized in 3 words: consent, deception, coercion. Another important aspect involves social relationships. During the phase of rise, people feel that they are part of a collective project. There is empathy. There is cooperation. There is trust. In the phase of decline, the focus changes. Now the priority is to maintain the status quo, to avoid changes that could threaten the system. In collapse, the dominant instinct becomes survival. Individuals and groups begin to act in self-defense, even if that means direct conflict with others. Another interesting detail involves the pace of these transformations. Rise tends to be fast, decline tends to be slow, but collapse can occur suddenly. Many people believe that a society in decline will continue to exist indefinitely, but history shows something different. Collapses usually occur when multiple crises arise at the same time. Wars, economic crises, environmental disasters, pandemics, Individually, these crises can be managed, but when several occur simultaneously, the system can become overwhelmed. This phenomenon is often called a perfect storm. Societies usually prepare for specific problems. A plan to deal with war, another to deal with epidemics, another to deal with economic crises. But they are rarely prepared to face all of these problems at the same time. When that happens, institutions can fail rapidly. There is another important factor: the capacity for internal criticism. During the phase of rise, people who criticize the system are valued. They help correct errors. But in more advanced stages of decline, criticism may be seen as a threat. Those who point out problems begin to be treated as enemies. This creates a paradox. The more a system needs criticism to adapt, the less it tolerates that criticism. As a result, societies may lose the ability to prepare for future threats. Problems accumulate, and when crises arise, it is already too late to react. Based on this historical model, some analysts try to make predictions about the future, especially for the Western world. One of the most discussed predictions involves the weakening of democratic freedoms. As systems enter phases of decline, governments may adopt more authoritarian measures. Another prediction involves economic difficulties. When citizens lose confidence in the system, motivation to work and invest may decrease. This reduces economic growth. Another possible phenomenon is the increase in migratory flows. Governments may resort to immigration to compensate for labor shortages. But rapid demographic changes can also generate social tensions, especially when local populations feel that their cultural identity is threatened. These tensions can evolve into internal conflicts, protests, political violence, deep ideological divisions. Finally, some analysts believe that governments may resort to external conflicts to deal with internal crises. Wars can serve as a way to mobilize the population or redirect social tensions. This does not necessarily mean that these predictions will come true. They represent only hypotheses based on historical patterns. Analytical models are tools. They help interpret trends, but the future is never completely predictable. If these predictions are confirmed in the next 5 or 10 years, the model will gain credibility. Otherwise, it will need to be revised. This is the true objective of any historical theory, not to impose certainties, but to offer frameworks that help us understand how power and societies evolve over time. If we accept this model of rise, decline, and collapse, then the central question arises: what does this mean for the current world, and especially for the next 5 to 10 years? According to this interpretation, many Western societies may be entering an advanced phase of decline. This does not necessarily mean that everything is collapsing immediately, but it indicates that certain structural signs are beginning to appear. The first sign involves political freedom. In young and rising societies, freedom of expression is usually broad. Public debate is encouraged. Criticism helps improve the system. But as institutions age and become more rigid, the space for criticism may shrink. Governments begin to see opponents as threats. Political control measures begin to expand. This can lead to the gradual weakening of democracy. Emergency laws, greater use of security forces, restrictions on certain types of speech. According to this analysis, this phenomenon can already be observed in various parts of the world, not only in traditional authoritarian regimes, but also in consolidated democracies. The second prediction involves the economy. When social trust declines, collective motivation also declines. People begin to feel that the system does not work for them. If citizens believe that effort will not be rewarded fairly, productivity may fall, investments decrease, innovation slows down. This can generate periods of economic stagnation, or even deeper crises. The third possible consequence involves immigration. Governments may try to compensate for demographic decline or labor shortages by bringing in foreign workers. From an economic point of view, this may seem like a practical solution. But rapid demographic changes can also generate cultural and political tensions. Local populations may feel that their identity is being replaced, and social conflicts may arise from this perception. This leads us to the fourth prediction: internal conflicts. When inequality, cultural tensions, and political polarization combine, societies may face episodes of civil violence. These conflicts do not always take the form of open wars. They may appear as violent protests, conflicts between ideological groups, or isolated episodes of political violence. But even fragmented conflicts can erode social stability, especially when institutions lose legitimacy. The fifth prediction involves external conflicts. Historically, governments facing internal crises sometimes resort to external wars. Wars can mobilize patriotism, they can redirect internal frustrations, and they can temporarily strengthen governments. During wars, populations often accept restrictions that they would normally reject: economic controls, emergency laws, expansion of executive power. For this reason, some analysts believe that international conflicts may become more frequent during periods of internal instability. It is important to remember that these predictions do not describe a fixed sequence. These phenomena may occur simultaneously, or in different orders. Political freedom may decline at the same time that economic crises arise. Immigration may increase while social tensions intensify, and external conflicts may appear amid internal crises. This type of combination creates highly unstable environments in which political decisions become increasingly difficult. Even so, this model is not intended to be an inevitable prophecy. It is merely an analytical tool, a way of interpreting historical patterns. If the coming decades follow this pattern, the model will have demonstrated some usefulness. If events take a different path, it will need to be revised. That is the nature of any theory about history. It tries to identify patterns, but it must always remain open to revision. Because the future rarely follows exactly the script we expect. Unexpected technological changes can alter historical trajectories. New leadership can transform political systems. Crises can generate profound reforms. Human history is full of surprises. Empires once considered invincible have disappeared. Societies once considered fragile have become powerful. Therefore, understanding the mechanisms of rise and decline does not mean accepting fatalism. It simply means trying to better understand the forces that shape the world. If we can understand these forces, perhaps we can act more consciously. Perhaps we can avoid certain mistakes of the past. And perhaps we can build more balanced systems in the future. Because in the end, theories about power and history are not just intellectual exercises. They are attempts to answer an essential question: how can human societies survive and prosper over time? And this remains one of the most important questions of our time. The story that opens this reflection begins with a seemingly extraordinary character, a man named Johnny King. According to the account presented, he embodies all the qualities that elite institutions tend to admire: military discipline, academic excellence, professional ambition. He is said to have served in special forces, enrolled in one of the top medical schools, and pursued a career in highly prestigious scientific institutions. An almost perfect resume. But behind this trajectory, there is a disturbing detail. A deep trauma experienced in childhood. An episode of violence that is said to have marked his life forever. According to this interpretation, this trauma may have transformed into psychological fuel, a force that drove extraordinary achievement, but also left deep marks on his personality. This example is used to raise a broader question. What kind of people does the elite educational system actually produce? Institutions such as Harvard, Yale, or Princeton are often seen as centers of intellectual excellence, places where the brightest minds are formed. But some critics argue that these institutions do not just educate, they also shape specific behaviors. According to this view, the modern meritocratic system creates very particular incentives. From an early age, students learn that the most important thing is not to learn. It is to win. Grades become the primary metric of value. Results replace intellectual curiosity. Competition replaces collaboration. In this environment, failure is no longer seen as a natural part of learning. It becomes a threat, something that must be avoided at all costs. But there is a paradox in this. Historically, many of the greatest learnings come precisely from failure. Failure forces reflection. Reflection generates learning. This process strengthens resilience. And resilience is one of the foundations of personal development. Before the modern meritocratic culture, many people intuitively understood this cycle. Fail, reflect, learn, grow. However, in highly competitive systems, failure can become forbidden. A mistake can damage academic averages. It can affect university admissions. It can compromise future careers. As a result, students begin to avoid intellectual risks. Exploration and curiosity are replaced by performance strategies. Another effect mentioned by critics involves the loss of time for reflection. Many young people live extremely structured schedules. School, assignments, extracurricular activities, exam preparation. Every minute is planned. Little space remains to think freely, to question, to explore ideas without immediate purpose. Without this mental space, the capacity for deep reflection may weaken, and without reflection, it becomes difficult to develop resilience. According to this critique, the meritocratic system may produce highly efficient individuals, but it does not always produce independent thinkers. For people who already belong to wealthy or influential families, this system may work well. It prepares these individuals to manage power. But for individuals from more modest backgrounds, the experience may be different. The pressure for immediate success can generate intense frustration, especially when expectations are unrealistic. In some cases, this can lead to deep personal crises, feelings of failure, loss of purpose, or depression. In the account presented, the narrator himself describes having gone through this kind of crisis. After graduating from an elite institution, he faced years of personal difficulties. He describes a period marked by professional frustrations, isolation, and deep questioning about the meaning of success. According to this reflection, true learning only began after that period, when he began to value three fundamental principles. First, keeping an open mind, recognizing that there is always more to learn. Second, accepting failure as an essential part of growth. Mistakes are not signs of incapacity. They are opportunities for learning. Third, developing resilience. The ability to keep trying despite difficulties. These three elements form a powerful cycle. Failure leads to reflection. Reflection strengthens resilience. Resilience enables growth. Over time, this process can reveal genuine talents, real passions, and more authentic life paths. This perspective also raises another important question. What does success really mean? For many modern educational systems, success means status, wealth, institutional prestige. But other cultural traditions define success differently, as personal development, social contribution, or fulfillment of purpose. These two views can come into conflict, especially in highly competitive environments. Some psychologists describe two fundamental modes of human functioning: the utilitarian mode and the altruistic mode. The utilitarian mode is driven by rewards, measurable results, competition. The altruistic mode is associated with human connection, cooperation, creativity, and collective purpose. According to this interpretation, these two modes do not always coexist easily. Highly competitive environments tend to activate the utilitarian mode, while collaborative environments favor creativity and innovation. This tension often appears in elite educational systems. Students are encouraged to demonstrate passion and idealism, but at the same time must compete fiercely for recognition. This contradiction can generate a type of psychological conflict, in which individuals feel that they need to play different roles at the same time. According to the critique presented, this dynamic turns many students into excellent social performers, people capable of adapting their speech and behavior according to the environment. But this constant adaptation raises another question. To what extent do these identities reflect genuine convictions? Or to what extent are they merely survival strategies within highly competitive systems? Answering this question requires something that no educational system can provide on its own: self-knowledge. In the end, institutions can offer tools, they can offer opportunities. But building a meaningful life depends on individual choices, choices about values, purpose, and the way we decide to learn throughout life. Perhaps this is the true lesson of this story. The deepest learning rarely happens only within institution. It happens when we are able to reflect honestly on our own experiences, and use those experiences to keep growing, even after the classroom ends. After presenting these criticisms of the elite educational system, the inevitable question arises: is there any way to escape this cycle? The proposed answer does not begin with immediate institutional reforms. It begins at the individual level, in the way each person chooses to learn. According to this reflection, the first step is to recognize the nature of the system, to understand that many educational environments prioritize performance and status more than deep learning. When this mechanism becomes visible, the individual can make a different choice: to pursue genuine learning instead of merely chasing credentials. This means valuing intellectual curiosity, asking questions, exploring ideas without the constant pressure of immediate results. It also means recovering something that many traditional cultures considered essential: time to think. Reflection requires mental space, and in modern societies, this space has often disappeared. Busy schedules, constant pressures, continuous evaluation. In this environment, deep thinking can become a rare luxury, but without reflection, true learning hardly happens. Another important change involves the relationship with failure. In highly competitive systems, failure may seem unacceptable. But outside these systems, failure often becomes one of the greatest teachers. Each mistake reveals limits. Each difficulty exposes something that still needs to be learned. When viewed this way, failure stops being a threat. It becomes a tool for growth. This shift in perspective requires something essential: intellectual humility. Recognizing that no one knows everything, that there are always new paths to explore, and new skills to develop. This attitude also favors something often associated with creativity: an open mind. People who are open to new ideas can connect different concepts, explore unknown territories, and find unexpected solutions. This type of mindset contrasts with environments that are excessively results-oriented, where the main focus is to meet specific goals. In these environments, experimentation may seem risky, but it is precisely experimentation that often leads to the most important discoveries. Another fundamental element in this process is resilience, the ability to keep moving forward despite difficulties. Resilience does not mean the absence of failure. It means learning from each failure and continuing to try. Over time, this combination of an open mind, reflection, and resilience can reveal something deeper: the discovery of a genuine passion. When a person finds something that truly motivates them, learning stops being an obligation. It becomes a natural process. Hours of practice no longer feel like sacrifice. Curiosity turns into creative energy. This type of learning rarely follows predictable paths. It can emerge at different moments in life, sometimes after years of trial and error. But when it emerges, it can completely redefine a person's path. This perspective also raises an important reflection about the concept of success. For a long time, success was associated with prestigious institutions, high-ranking positions, material wealth. But more and more people are beginning to question these definitions, asking whether success should also include other elements: intellectual autonomy, contribution to society, personal meaning. These questions do not have universal answers. Each society and each individual may interpret them differently. But they reveal something essential. The debate about education is not only technical, it is also philosophical. It involves values, expectations, and different visions about the purpose of human life. Perhaps that is why discussions about universities, meritocracy, and success evoke such intense emotions. They directly touch personal dreams. Dreams of social mobility, of recognition, of fulfillment. When these dreams clash with reality, frustrations may arise, but new questions may also emerge. Questions about what is truly worth learning, and about how each person can build their own path. In the end, no institution can fully define that path. Universities can offer opportunities. They can transmit knowledge. But the deepest learning depends on something that goes beyond any system: the ability to keep learning throughout life. And perhaps that is the true message behind this story. Education does not end with a diploma. It begins there, and continues as long as there is curiosity, reflection, and the desire to grow. Many civilizations flourished before ours. Some dominated vast territories. Others disappeared almost without leaving traces. What remains are clues, scattered through time, silent monuments, fragmented manuscripts, stories passed down through generations. Each discovery brings us a little closer to the truth, but history still holds many secrets. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.